Hi everyone, welcome to the second training video. Today we'll be covering the principles of design. We'll be learning about them and how they interact with each other to create visually appealing and functional designs. And getting started with our agenda, one, we'll be covering why it's important to learn about them, and two, we'll be covering all 12 of them, including examples from different areas of design, from graphic to UI UX to illustration. So covering the basic design principles, the principles are a set of rules that designers can follow when creating a composition to create visually pleasing work. The purpose of these rules is to deliver a message in the most organized and functional way. These principles are super important when it comes to design projects at GC. You should be able to use this vocabulary to describe why an existing design is insufficient or why your design proposal is comprehensive in its approach. There's no real consensus in the design community about what the main principles of design actually are. That being said, I'll be discussing 12 principles that are mentioned most often in articles and books on the subject. Getting started with number one, contrast occurs when elements in a composition have vastly different properties such as color, size, and shape. You can use contrast to create focus, emphasis, and interesting visual elements. And contrast is a very important aspect of creating accessible designs. Insufficient contrast can make text content in particular very difficult to read, especially for people with visual impairments. So here's a pretty obvious bad example of using contrast. As you can see, the rainbow background does not do the text any justice. And if you were someone who had a difficulty seeing, obviously it would be nearly impossible to navigate this website. So avoid creating any designs that look like this, please. Here's a better example of using contrast, both within like text and color. As you can see, like Reshape Industries here is highlighted in blue to kind of contrast against the white text on the black background. And here, this being highlighted in this circle, which is kind of different from the rest of the graphic. Moving on to balance. Balance in any composition occurs when the objects in it have visual equilibrium. Balance can be symmetrical with items of equal weight on either side of the center line, kind of like this example here, or asymmetrical with items of different weights laid out in relation to a line that may or may not be centered. Use balance to create focus by using visual weights. And here's a bad and good example of using balance in a kind of layout work. As you can see on the left here, everything's kind of left aligned. There's no real dynamic interaction between the different parts of the content versus on the right here, using balance between both sides. If you were to drop a line straight down the middle of that document, the weight on both sides would be pretty even since you have the picture of those bottles kind of interacting with the text in a certain way. And here's another good example of Apple's landing page for the iPhone 12. Apple's pretty well known for using balance in their work. Similarly, if you were to drop a line down the middle of this, the weight on both sides would be pretty even. But with that being said, not all good design is essentially symmetrically balanced. As you can see here, here's a design that's asymmetrical. If you were to drop a line down the center of these different frames, you see the tiles are a little not aligned, and you have an illustration here that's not center aligned either. So just a reminder that you can have asymmetrical design that's still good for design and can be functional. Moving on to emphasis. Emphasis means to create focus at a particular design element to signify its importance. It can also be used to minimize how much an element stands out. Think about fine print. And you can use emphasis to create focal points on your design. So here are two examples here of using emphasis. As you can see, the Coca-Cola bottles against the bright red background kind of creates this illusion that they're standing out against them to create that smile. And then here you can see that the he's okay is kind of emphasized in red against the she's broken to kind of create a double meaning within this phrase, which is kind of funny. Moving on to proportion or scale. Proportion is the relationship between objects with reference to their size and visual weight, and you can use scale to make elements larger, giving it higher importance than smaller elements. Okay, and here's an example of interior design. If you're familiar with that kind of area, you can kind of tell pretty immediately that the proportion of the couch in relation to the other objects in the room make it stand out in a negative way. It's just very large and makes the room look way smaller than it probably actually is. And overall, it's a very insufficient design for this room. Moving on to something like a landing page, you can see that the proportion of the image in relation to the text kind of makes the image a lot more important than, say, the navigation system here or the name of the artist. And it's creating that emphasis just by using the size of the image. Moving on to hierarchy. Hierarchy is the process of arranging elements so it conveys info to users in a simple manner. You can use hierarchy in design to show the order of importance. Typically, the most important elements tend to appear first in a group of elements. Here's a bad and good example of using hierarchy. As you can see here on the left, all the text is pretty much the same size. There's no like visual way to differentiate between what you should read first and maybe what's the most important, versus on the right here, you have a clear header and a subtext / body text and a button, and you read it top to bottom, and it's pretty easy to tell which information you're supposed to read first versus last. Here we have repetition. A component is repeated when other components with features similar to it are arranged in composition, and you can use repetition to unify a design and provide consistency. This can be done by using the same colors, images, or similar choices. And here you can see the repetition of these rectangular images on the left-hand side of this design kind of just unify the branding across the website. Moving on to rhythm. Rhythm occurs when an object has varying distances between several frequencies, and you can use rhythm to influence emotions, create excitement with irregular rhythms, and create calmness with regular rhythms in design. Here's a pretty good example of irregular rhythm within this landing page. I'd say that the rhythm of the shapes in the background kind of create that sense of excitement or childlike wonder, which I think really serves the purpose of the website art classes and Canvas for Kids. Here we have pattern. Patterns can refer to the repetition of design elements, and they can also refer to the set standards of how certain elements are designed. You can kind of think about how print clothing is very popular. Some people might argue that it's just the brand itself that makes it popular, but really thinking about how the patterned clothing creates that sense of like visual appeal that people seem to like very much with these examples. Moving on to white space. White space is the empty space in any design. It's also known as negative space, and you can use white space to emphasize an element in a composition. Simply put, it's used to create focus. And white space is pretty popularly used in logo design. There's some pretty creative ways that you can do it. For example, the arrow in the FedEx logo with a spoon and the pen tip of the Yellow the Food Writers make just for some pretty creative uses of that particular space. Movement. Movement means guiding the user's eye to a predetermined path in a composition. The most important element should lead to the next, and so on. And you can use movement to suggest how external forces can move or has moved an object. A pretty popular example is maybe the liquid gradients that you can kind of see online. Some of them are live and kind of move as you move around the page, which is pretty cool. An illustration you can kind of see here in this manga, the movement of the cape with the swing of the sword and the movement of the like air particles around it kind of give that effect of the swinging motion, which is really cool. And you also have this use of movement playing in the like the 3D eye trick graphics. The image isn't moving, and the use of the movement kind of tricks your eye into thinking that it is. All right, and moving on to variety. Variety means adding a change to disrupt the monotony of a composition. You can use variety to create visual interest in a design, and this can be done through typography, color, images, texture, and other design elements. Here's a good example of variety in a landing page. You can see that there's different colors, different shapes, different fonts used to create this landing page, but it seems to be all pretty unified, which is pretty cool. And finally, we have unity. Unity means creating a sense of visual similarity between different elements in a composition. Use unity to make design elements support each other to achieve consistency. And here is a great example of unity on this e-commerce website. All the elements seem to be pretty similarly formatted, and it all fits within this kind of grid, which makes it easy to navigate as well. Okay, so you finished this video. Please drop a comment down below with the following. 1, what is one thing that you learned about design principles from this video? And 2, why is it important to you to understand the principles of design? Consider the value of accessible and effective design today. I'll be checking and responding to comments this weekend, and your comment counts as your participation for this activity, which is required for the training program. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you next week.